What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we're going to jump in and talk about Season 6 in Destiny 2. So I do want to give some of my kind of raw thoughts on what Bungie have shown off, but specifically in this video I wanted to focus on some of the feedback from the community as well. There's a lot of discussion about how much content is in this drop, and Gambit specifically is an element that does get a mixed response from players. You know, there are some folks who simply don't enjoy Gambit, or maybe don't get all that excited by the idea of more Gambit content. But of course Gambit will not be the only content that we get over the next season, so I wanted to round out generally what folks should expect from this content drop, what to expect especially if you're not a huge fan of Gambit, and really considering how many other games and things are going on right now, I wanted to set those expectations but also discuss whether D2 might be worth your time if you're also playing other stuff that's coming out. Just a quick shout before we get into it, thank you guys so much for helping me hit 400,000 subscribers. Obviously, that is a pretty crazy number, definitely something I never expected to achieve, so before we get into the video I just wanted to say a quick thank you. It is something that I plan to recognize properly outside of this video, but nonetheless the support has been incredible, so thank you to everyone who tunes into the content that I make. You guys make it all worthwhile. Now though, let's talk about Season 6. I think we should mention the value of this update in terms of, the DLC, the actual price that we're paying. Of course, this is the second drop as part of the annual pass. And so these drops, what do they cost? They're something a little over $10, something like that. And I think that the content value is actually pretty damn high. Of course, we may not always love all of the elements of the content drops that Bungie are bringing, but in terms of how much progression, how much new endgame, the amount of content in general that we get as part of an annual pass update, I think the value is very, very high. That is kind of a personal opinion really, I suppose, but I think it's one that's worth mentioning before we talk about the rest of the content that's coming up. So first up, let's speak about the new Gambit content itself. We're getting two new modes, one called Gambit Prime. This behaves a lot like traditional Gambit really, although it will be a faster paced mode. However, the Reckoning mode is a purely PvE focused thing that doesn't really behave in the same way as Gambit, or at least what we've seen so far. So if you're someone that's not a huge Gambit fan, what does this update actually look like for a non-Gambit player? Well, if you've already decided that you're not really going to enjoy the Gambit content, then of course, there is this core gameplay focus around Gambit in Season 6, so potentially you are going to miss a chunk of content. However, we should talk about some of the rewards. It appears that the new armor sets will still be achievable without playing an absolute ton of Gambit. They'll require at least a moderate amount of the new mode because the synths that create the armor pieces will initially drop in Gambit Prime. However, the perks that affect Gambit Prime are separately unlocked by more difficult tiers in the Reckoning mode. So it looks like you could play kind of base levels, clear a little bit of Gambit Prime, and you could actually unlock these new armor pieces without bothering to go to the effort of unlocking all of the bonuses they could have specifically for Gambit, right? And the good thing is that they still come with all of the typical bonuses and mod slots, so if you simply want a shiny new set of armor, then outside of a smaller initial investment into Gambit, it is something you can do without playing an absolute ton. But of course, if you are a Gambit fan, if you're someone who wants more Gambit content, then this is going to deliver a much more kind of expansive ecosystem and endgame for the Gambit modes. The new weapons that are going to drop in this update do appear to be linked to Gambit Prime, so possibly through random drops, hitting certain rank thresholds, things like that. So it's safe to say, especially for the weapons, that will take a fair amount of investment into the new Gambit mode. So to summarize, when it comes to the Gambit stuff, I can understand a lot of the kind of perspectives, and folks who don't necessarily enjoy Gambit all that much. Let's also bear in mind that if you're playing solo, Gambit can be a pretty difficult experience. And I'll be completely honest, when I've played Gambit, it doesn't tend to be solo, although it is something that I've experienced. And for me personally, I think it's really cool that there's new Gambit content because I'm hoping that this will pique my interest in Gambit once again, right? I enjoyed traditional Gambit, but it definitely has not been one of my favorite modes in the game, so I'm kind of one of those who's looking for a new reason to play it. It's hard to say if this is something that'll still be replayable in 3 months' time, for example, but hopefully on the whole, depending on what type of player you are, that gives you a better idea of what to expect from the new Gambit modes. Of course though, also, inside of this update, we're going to be getting new character progression. So if you're someone who definitely doesn't want to be playing a ton of Gambit, this is the point of the video where I'd pay a little bit more attention, because this is going to be some of the core content that will engage you. So of course, we've got the new power climb, and there are a lot of folks who say without a raid, why is it relevant to climb to a new power level? Well, from a technical perspective, it is good to get a high level for stuff like the quest content that we're going to see. Remember when we got the last word, you've got kind of 650 power missions at the end of that quest. And when it comes to things like Thorn, anything else inside of this update, we could be looking at, getting on for 700 power. So the higher end quest content does tend to require higher levels, But also, another big reason power level will be important this time around would be for the Reckoning mode, especially when we get to those higher tiers, Reckoning tier 2 and 3, I would anticipate that they're going to require a decent power level. The initial one that we get unlocked when the DLC launches is probably going to be around about our current power level, or the maximum level at least, so probably around 650. I'd imagine tier 2 is probably going to be closer to 680, and then tier 3 probably pretty close to 700, if not 700. On top of this, when you invade in Gambit, power level is relevant, as well as in things like Iron Banner. So those are the current kind of core reasons. In terms of other progression, there are new pinnacle weapons. Of course, these are a great layer of content over the top. They're great weapons if you want them. I'll link a video below that has more details about pinnacle weapons if that's something you're curious about. But there will also be a new title seal, which is probably going to require a fair amount of the new Gambit content. So that's worth bearing in mind. But these are just some of the kind of loose progression systems that'll be updated. We should talk about PvP progression though. Of course, we had news that there will be no trials in this season, and it sounds like it's going to be a fair amount of time before that potentially returns. And for players who are very PvP focused, there is a pretty minimal kind of pinnacle endgame for PvP at the moment. And it doesn't look like that is particularly going to change going into Season 6. So, really, if you're a PvP player, you can expect a fairly similar experience. We get a new pinnacle weapon, that'll be the PvP SMG, but much like other seasons, once you've unlocked that, you're probably going to be left doing more or less what you're doing right now when it comes to PvP content. If you are a PvP focused player, I would absolutely recommend that you check out a recent video from Kamicakes who was speaking about kind of PvP and the current state of that, especially when it comes to some kind of PvP endgame. I'll link that video down below, but for folks who are purely PvP players who are pretty frustrated right now, I can 100% relate to what you're saying. I'm someone who enjoys PvP content, I've played a bit of comp, I played a fair amount of trials when that was a thing, but for me it's not as difficult because I'm pretty omnivorous, I play basically everything that's in the game. However, if you don't do that and PvP is your primary kind of thing, then definitely I can relate to the fact that folks are saying PvP as an endgame in D2 right now is pretty lackluster. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I know there will be mixed opinions on it, but it's definitely something worth mentioning. Now though, let's talk more about content in Season 6. What else could we possibly expect? Well, of course, there will be new exotics. Most of these are probably going to be associated with quests. So we know that the Thorn is returning. If that's a weapon that interests you, then I'm sure you already know about it. Definitely going to be a quest reward, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was a pretty similar experience to what we had with The Last Word. There are other exotics in this update as well. We know that there are going to be some exotic armor pieces, whatever exactly they turn out to be, and there is probably at least 2 other exotic weapons coming in this update. So how should you think about these exotics? Well, honestly, I think the best way to set some kind of expectation is to probably look at how things worked in Black Armory. A lot of this stuff's going to be questified. It'll probably roll out over the first couple of weeks, and that's something to mention in itself. With this roadmap for the Season 6 content, Bungie have kind of squished a lot of it into the first 4 weeks, right? Whereas Black Armory felt like it was stretched out a little bit longer, and part of that would have been because of the winter break and stuff like that. But this time around, the core content for Season 6 is pretty much all going to be delivered by late March. If you were a fan of Destiny's lore, then actually I think this is going to be a pretty fantastic update. Firstly, we're getting a new Allegiance quest, and there is a lot of speculation about how this is going to work. Bungie describe it as a quest that'll invite you to choose between the Vanguard and the Drifter, and you pick a side to progress through the quest from their perspective. The pledge will be character-based, so you can play through it from different perspectives if you have multiple Guardians. Now, what should we expect from this quest though? Well, I think firstly, there's going to be some pretty epic lore, right? We get to understand more of the motivations of the Drifter, and potentially the Vanguard perspective there. We don't, however, know what the rewards will look like. Some folks think it'll be an epic quest to choose between the Thorn and maybe some other weapon. The Allegiance quest does actually land on the same day as the Thorn quest. Otherwise, we don't really know what to expect. Certainly, expect this to be a more story-heavy content drop than some of the other stuff that we're going to see. It is also going to behave as a weekly ritual, as far as we can tell, and then there is Invitations to the Nine as well, another kind of weekly questing system that'll start with a bounty from Xur. And I think the best way to think about these is kind of like an Oracle to the Offering style piece of content, but with much more basic mechanics, right? It's going to drop lore, powerful rewards, exotics, at least at the kind of normal rate, potentially at a higher rate when it comes to Invitations of the Nine as well, and it's going to feature some narrative content. We should also mention that Xur is going to be selling gear to exotics as well, after the update coming this week. And I think really, in terms of the DLC content specifically, this kind of rounds out what to expect. Of course, the core game is focused around this new Gambit content. That's where a bunch of the legendary weapon rewards will come from, that's where a bunch of the armor will come from, and as we spoke about, you don't have to invest super heavily to completely upgrade those sets if it's not something that interests you. You could potentially play a fairly small amount of Gambit, go into Reckoning and unlock these armor sets to use elsewhere, and that's if you're not a Gambit player. Of course, if you are a Gambit fan, things are about to get much more interesting. Outside of that though, we need to look at the character progression, and you can also look at how this worked in Black Armory, how the exotic quests worked in Black Armory, and the recent way that Bungie have delivered kind of ritual-style narrative content that also drops rewards in the game. In a lot of respects, we kind of know what the formula is going to be, and on the whole, my thoughts about this, I'm pretty excited for it. I really like the look of the new Gambit Prime armor. As I said before, I'm not the biggest Gambit fan, but I'm kind of hoping that this is going to be a good reason to go back in, engage in this content. And for me personally, I tend to get a bit more competitive when the stakes are kind of there, right? And for me, with this kind of game mode, when I get more competitive, I get more interested in it. So I'd say at the very least, I'm open to the new Gambit content. That's kind of where I stand right now, but I definitely want the rewards from the new content. Otherwise, we've spoken about a lot of the loose progression that we'll see in this DLC, and I think that most of the stuff outside of the new Gambit content itself, as I've mentioned, will probably work somewhere along the lines with what we've seen in other annual pass drops. But if you have been wondering what this content will look like on the whole, then hopefully this video has done a decent job of kind of rounding it out. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it down below. What do you guys think of the upcoming DLC content? Are you going to be jumping into Gambit, or is Gambit something that really turns you off? I'd also be curious, is Destiny going to be kind of a primary game for you over the next few weeks, or are you planning to focus more on things like Division, any other new games that you're playing in the moment? I'd be generally curious to get a picture of how you guys feel. Nonetheless, thank you so much for tuning in today. Let me know your thoughts about it down below. If you've enjoyed this video, a like is very much appreciated. If not, drop me that dislike. As long as the feedback is genuine, then it's actually pretty useful, right? And I can make hopefully better content. But thank you for sticking around, 400k, all that stuff, man. It's just mad. I'll keep you guys posted, and I'll do my best, of course, to deliver content that you all appreciate. I super appreciate all of you guys who tune in day to day and show me support here on the channel. It's cheesy, I know, but it has literally changed my life. It's allowed me to do something that I really enjoy, and hopefully I can keep making content that you guys enjoy just as much. For now though, thank you for tuning in. I'll keep you posted over the next week or so with the new content, so if you are new around here, be sure to hit subscribe if you want to keep up to date, but otherwise, I'll catch you guys very soon.